Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley, and if you're new here, this is HeebeeJeebeez TV, and we like to talk about stuff like true crime, unsolved mysteries, and of course the paranormal. Alright, so before we get into the video, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has been following me over on TikTok. We now have a little bit over 8,000 followers. I should hit about 9 in the next day or so, which is really exciting. It's a lot of fun over there. I post a lot of other content over there, short stories about videos that I haven't done on here, and sometimes I do a few recaps of the longer videos that I've done on YouTube. So if you guys like the TikTok format, follow me over there. It's the same username at HeebeeJeebeez TV. And I also just want to say a quick thank you to everyone who has been subscribing on my YouTube channel. We went up a few hundred followers in the past week. I see a lot of people coming over from TikTok. So again, thank you guys for the support, and let's just keep going because I'm a little bit closer to hitting the 1,000 mark, and I would love to be able to do that in the next couple weeks. All right, so today's story is going to be another paranormal one, and we're actually going to talk about a location that I've heard about for a very long time, and I'm honestly surprised that I haven't done a video on it. And that is the story behind Poveglia Island in Italy, right across from Venice. So like I said, just off the coast of Venice are a few different islands, and it's basically like a very large lagoon. And while Venice has this amazing reputation for being one of the most romantic islands or even destinations in the world, right across from it is another island that has a very dark and deep history behind it. So Poveglia Island, like I said, the history behind it is quite long, but it's just not about unethical practices or horrific stories about what happened there. There's also a lot of paranormal activity on this island, and it's even supposedly one of the most haunted destinations, not just in Italy or Europe, but in the world. So to understand a little bit more about Poveglia, we're going to go back into history a little bit. And the first record we have about people living on the island goes back to 421 AD, when people were seeking refuge from the barbarian attacks. There was a lot of people seeking a safe and quiet environment to live in, and they found it on Poveglia Island. People lived here for several hundred years, and that was the case up until 1379. At that point, the residents living there had to flee once again due to warfare. And I could go on into a lot more detail about the history, but my channel is just not necessarily about a full-on history lesson, so I won't go into too much detail. But if you guys are interested in learning more about the historical facts of certain things, let me know in the comments below, and then I can make some adjustments in future videos. So after 1379, the island was pretty empty for a little bit. That was until 1403. At that point, the Italian government started turning local islands, including the ones surrounding Venice, turning them into what they call lazarettos, which are essentially just special quarantine stations. These were then used to basically hold victims who were displaying symptoms of the bubonic plague. And at that point, the virus was spreading like complete wildfire. Almost everyone was a victim of this disease. And if you don't know what the bubonic plague is, I'll tell you guys a little bit about it. So the bubonic plague was a virus that actually results from being bitten by a tick. However, humanity was not prepared for what would happen with this virus. It spread very, very quickly throughout Europe, throughout parts of the Middle East, throughout Asia as well. Symptoms of this virus were said to be extremely painful, and they would appear 2 to 7 days after you would get bit. And a few examples of the symptoms you would experience would be stuff like chills. You would get extremely high fevers, a lot of body aches, cramps, extreme swelling, seizures. Some people even develop gangrene, which would then lead to necrosis, and then that would ultimately lead to death. And the thing about this virus is that it was highly contagious. The most catastrophic era of this bubonic plague was during the 1300s, when it was said to have completely decimated 1/3 of Europe's population. And if you think about that, and if I think about that now with 1/3 of Europe just completely being eradicated, it's a very scary thought. So as the plague just kept spreading and getting worse and worse, the government wasn't taking any chances. So at this point, they decided to start basically ripping anyone who displayed the slightest symptom and throwing them onto the island. It was estimated that in the year 1630, approximately 80,000 people died on that island in a span of just 7 months. And for those who managed to somehow survive by some sort of miracle, they were said to have forced to spend 40 days quarantining on the island. And a bit of a fun fact, the word quarantine actually comes from the Italian word for 40, which is 40. So after that initial wave, the plague just kept coming back. It wasn't something that humans were able to completely get rid of. And even to this day, you'll find the occasional person that does contract the disease, but thankfully, due to science, we're able to control it and eradicate it a lot quicker. But it was still a very threatening presence throughout the 17 and 1800s. The island was then given to the Public Health Office, and it was then turned into a checkpoint to not just deal with the imports and exports going out of the country or that region, but it was also used to look at and investigate the ships that were coming in to make sure that they weren't bringing in the virus as well. However, in 1793, there were 2 cargo ships that were said to have had multiple passengers that had the Black Plague. So, the island wasn't taking any chances. So at this point, they decided to make the island a quarantine zone once again. Then in 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte decided to make the island a permanent quarantine zone, and this remained that way until 1814. So as you can imagine, life on the island as a victim that was infected was definitely not easy. To begin with, the island was already quite small. It was said to be only 17 acres, but throughout the hundreds of years, it's estimated that it once housed over 160,000 victims. Initially, the dead were giving a relatively normal burial, but like I said, the island was quite small, and so they realized that they were quickly running out of space. People started dying a lot faster, and because this virus was so contagious and so deadly, people were dying too fast for the authorities to keep up with. At one point, it was said that there were over 500 people dying per day. And knowing that they simply could not bury this many people per day, they decided to do the next best thing, which was essentially to cremate everyone. What they would do is that they would start digging these mass graves, and when people would die, they would literally just throw their bodies in there and they would pile them up, and when it got full, they would light it all on fire. And believe it or not, because of how many people actually died on the island and how many people were cremated, it's suspected that the island, 50% of the soil on there is actually made from human ashes. So then we fast forward to 1814, and the island had earned a new nickname. People started calling it the Island of the Ghosts. And this was obviously due to how many people had died on the island while they were in quarantine. Then it was said to have remained basically abandoned for about 100 years until 1922. Then in 1922, the first mental hospital on the island was said to have opened. However, rumors started to spread that it wasn't just any ordinary mental hospital. The rumors were basically that there was some dark stuff happening over there. It was speculated that the hospital wasn't actually used to be a hospital or to even care for people. It was suspected that the hospital was being used for exile purposes instead of providing rehabilitation or patient care. Then, of course, there's a story, and if you know anything about this island, you know the story as well. It's the story of the sadistic doctor. Now, unfortunately, I've looked high and low. I literally looked everywhere to see if I could find a record of this guy's name, but I could not find anything. However, I have heard a few stories on YouTube about people talking about the island and its history, and a few people seem to think the doctor's name was Paolo. However, because the hospital was running during the reign of Mussolini, a lot of the documents of the hospital and just government documents were either destroyed or lost after World War II. It was said that he believed that lobotomies were a fantastic way to help people with mental illness. So this is exactly what he started doing to a lot of these patients. And if you don't know what a lobotomy is, I'm going to tell you. So a lobotomy is an operation that takes place on your skull and it goes into your brain. So the way they would do this is that the doctors would drill a hole into your skull in order to sever the connection in the brain's prefrontal cortex. This was done to treat illnesses like epilepsy in order to reduce the symptoms people were experiencing. However, these surgeries and these experiments had a lot of negative side effects. For example, they made people forget quite a bit. They made people incontinent. People became unresponsive. And there was one doctor named Walter Freeman, and he even coined the term surgically induced childhood to describe the effects of lobotomy. Essentially, having a lobotomy put you into a sort of vegetative state where you could no longer take care of yourself. And if that wasn't enough, it was also said that the doctor would perform these lobotomies using basically makeshift tools that he shouldn't have been using, like chisels and hammers, which would have made them extremely painful for the patients. And of course, as you can imagine, none of these items were ever sterile, resulting in who knows how many infections and multiple deaths. So back on the island, the doctor was said to have performed a lot of his surgeries up in a portion of the building known as the Bell Tower. He was said to have brought his patients upstairs and locked the doors, where he was able to perform some very unethical and disgusting surgeries on them. A few examples of things he would do on them were, of course, the lobotomies, but he would also do a lot of chemical and biological experiments on people and amputations as well. Patients throughout the hospital would tell stories about how they would hear the screams of the patients he had taken up to the bell tower across the entire hospital, especially at night when it was quiet. Eventually, though, the doctor started to lose his mind. He started going completely mad because it was said that he was hearing and seeing the spirits of all the tortured souls on the island. It was said to have driven him absolutely insane to the point where he climbed to the top of the bell tower and then literally threw himself off the tower down to the ground. Now, apparently, the fall did not completely kill him. He was apparently still alive, and there was a witness, a nurse that was standing near the bottom where he landed. She said that he was still alive when he hit the floor. However, something very strange happened right after. As she was staring at him, she said that she noticed a mist, kind of like a fog, completely engulfing the doctor. And then it somehow started suffocating him or choking him until he died. Somehow, though, even after the doctor's death, the hospital remained open until 1946. Then it was turned into a private long-term care home for elderly people up until 1968, when it was sold to a private owner. However, he sold it rather quickly after trying to apparently make a home for himself on the island. He was said to have been driven out by the ghosts of the island rather quickly. Then in the 70s, it was also reportedly sold to a family that actually wanted to build a sort of vacation home on the island. So one night they decided to spend the evening on the island, kind of figuring out what they wanted to do with it. So the entire family is there, but the story goes, they fled the island screaming and wanted to just get out of there as fast as they could, because on that particular night, they had seen a bunch of different shadows. There was screaming going on. There was noises they couldn't explain. And it's even reported that one of the daughters of the family, who was about 14 years old at the time, was said to have been so violently attacked by a spirit that they had basically ripped part of her face open, and it required well over a dozen stitches. Then in the 80s, it was sold to an Italian businessman, and he had received permission from the Italian government to renovate the island and to start construction on it. So everything had essentially been approved, and construction workers arrived on the island. Everything was going according to plan, but just 3 days later, it was said that the entire work crew, the entire construction crew, completely walked off the island and vowed to never return. I could not find details about what spooked these guys so much that they would refuse to do their work on the island, but it's said that they must have experienced something completely terrifying for them to just completely abandon this project. The businessman was then basically forced to sell the island a year later. To this day, it remains unclear with how many people have purchased and sold the island throughout the decades. However, in 2014, it was sold to a man named Luigi Brugnaro in 2014, who was said to have wanted to build a sort of luxury resort or luxury hotel on the island, but to this day, nothing has been built on the island. So we don't know exactly where that stands. So of course, now that the island is privately owned, it is illegal for people to go visit and explore the island. However, that doesn't stop a lot of people from going. There's plenty of thrill seekers, paranormal investigators that really just want to go see the island for themselves and see if the stories of all of these hauntings are actually real. And of course, as you can imagine, there are hundreds of these stories available online about people who have had spooky experiences. I've gone through quite a bit of them, and this is like a summary of what people have experienced on the island. So of course, you can imagine people report hearing a lot of screaming on the island. They imagine that these screams are coming from the people that were tortured in the hospital or people that were killed on the island from the disease, people that were burnt possibly alive as well. There's one particular voice that sounds to be not quite human, but definitely a male voice that is said to tell people to turn around and leave the island and never come back. There's also reports of shadow figures moving across the walls in the hospital following people. Then there's the spirit of the little girl named Maria. The consensus seems to be that she was a victim of the plague. And fishermen for the past 400 years have been reporting sightings of the same little girl running around, specifically along the coastline, screaming out for help. At one point, it was said to have scared fishermen so much that they refused to go fishing anywhere near the island. Some spirits even get physical with people. People have reported being pushed. People have said that they've been scratched. Their hair has been pulled. People have been blatantly attacked on this island by spirits that they cannot see. Then, of course, there is the reports of strange smells. Some people say that the island smells like decay. Other people say that they smell sulfur and the smell of wood burning. Then there's the bell tower. This is where the doctor was said to have brung people to experiment on them. And during one of the phases where the island was supposedly renovated or attempted to be renovated, the bell inside the tower was removed. However, some people have reported hearing the bell ringing. It's suspected that this must be the doctor still trapped on the island, ringing the bell, letting people know that his presence is still around. So like I said, the island is not open to tourists. Not anyone can just go on the island. You do need special permission. And sometimes the special permission is granted. And a few times, a few psychics have actually been given this permission to go on the island just to see what their perspective or if they could deliver any messages from the dead. What the psychics have all agreed on is that the island is filled with a lot of very angry and dark spirits. And a few of these psychics were even have said to have been so terrified that they refused to return to the island. Another person that was able to gain special access to the island was the world-renowned paranormal investigator Zach Bagans in 2009. And he took his show Ghost Adventures along with him. So part of their initial plan was to stay on the island for approximately 24 hours undisturbed. But they got a lot more than they had bargained for. Throughout their stay, their equipment started malfunctioning. It was completely going bananas. The batteries would drain almost instantly. The crew, of course, heard a lot of strange voices. They would see strange shadows following them around. If you watch the show, and I'm sure it's available on a few streaming services, you'll be able to see a lot more of what they captured. And in a few clips, you'll see that they were able to capture some strange orbs. There was a few strange shadows as well. However, there's one part of the show that is quite terrifying. And that's when Zach himself was said to have been possessed by something. So in that part of the episode, you can see Zach kind of wandering off. And he was said to have been provoking the spirits in order to get a reaction out of them, saying things in Italian. one of his team members was also trying to do the same thing. And you can hear him yelling out the words, risota a la mia energía, which basically means use my energy. And I just want to say, if you are into anything paranormal, if you guys believe in ghosts, or if you're a paranormal investigator, I highly recommend that you do not do this. Do not provoke the spirits. Do not invite them to use your energy to come into your home, to come into your body, because you are literally giving them permission to do whatever they want to do to you. And you have to remember that not all spirits are good. Not all spirits are neutral. There are some bad energies out there, and not all of them will leave voluntarily. Not all of them will leave if you tell them to. So just be careful when you're playing around with the spirit world. I do not recommend letting them come into you. So as Zach is wandering off, provoking these spirits, he suddenly seems to be attacked by something invisible. You can kind of see his arms flailing around, and he kind of looks like he's fighting off something. And after the episode, he ended up talking about what happened and explained a little bit in more detail about what he was feeling at the time. He ended up saying that he felt like his body had been taken over, almost as if he were possessed, because he said he felt like someone was looking through his eyes. It was no longer him. And on top of that, he started feeling this unusual amount of anger. He said it was an extreme anger that he had never felt before. And it was so intense that he had this giant urge to attack one of his team members, which he said he had to fight off very, very much in order for him not to actually attack him. The entire experience was not shown on the actual TV show. It was way too long, but he said that the experience from when he first was attacked to the point where he was okay again was about an entire hour. So as you can imagine, like any other sort of paranormal story, there are people that are going to be quite skeptic about whether this is a true story or not. And there are a lot of people that think Poveglia Island is nothing but, just a bunch of hocus pocus. Aside from the fact that it was used as a quarantine station and there were a lot of people that died, there's people that think that the stories about the doctor specifically are fake. However, I'm going to leave that for you guys to decide. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Is Poveglia Island haunted by the tortured souls of the mental hospital, of the plague? Or even better yet, have you guys ever been to Poveglia Island? I know there's a bunch of underground water taxis that will take you there, but apparently it's extremely expensive because you're not supposed to go. But let me know if you guys have ever been on the island or know anyone that's been on the island. I would love to hear your experiences. But I'm going to leave it at that. That's it for today's story. And if you guys have any other case suggestions, leave them in the comments below. And don't forget to follow me on YouTube and on TikTok for more true crime and paranormal content. All right, guys, thanks for joining me, and I will see you in the next video.